Welcome to Cyber Bytes, your weekly dose in the latest in cybersecurity news. I'm your host, Edwin Kwan, and this week's stories are a good snapshot of where cybersecurity actually is in 2026, not where we thought it would be. We're not talking about encryption being broken or some brand new class of attacks out of nowhere. Instead, what we're seeing is attackers consistently working around strong technology, quietly exploiting long-standing assumptions, and increasingly targeting the messy edges of how systems and people actually behave. From Cigna dealing with social engineering to an 18-year-old bug in Nginx, to supply chain compromises and AI systems operating without oversight. The pattern is the same. The controls we trust are often fine. The way we use them is where things start to fall apart. So let's start our story with Cigna. Cigna has rolled out a new in-app warning system designed to flag messages from unknown contacts. On the surface, this sounds pretty simple. And it is. But it's also a very direct response to a growing problem. Attackers aren't trying to break Cigna's encryption. They've stopped trying. Instead, they're targeting the user. There's been a noticeable increase in campaigns where threat actors impersonate trusted figures, including government officials, and initiate conversations that look legitimate enough to get a response. Once that trust is established, the attacker shifts the interaction towards something actionable, such as clicking a link, joining a group, or sharing information. What Cigna is doing here is inserting friction at exactly the right moment. When a message comes from outside your contacts, the app now prompts you to pause and think before engaging. That's not a technical control in the traditional sense. It's behavior, and that's what the key point is. We're seeing a broader shift across the industry where security controls are being designed around human decision making, not just system hardening. Because in an environment where encryption is strong, identity becomes the attack surface. And identity, in practice, is often just trust plus timing. For organizations, especially those relying on secure messaging platforms internally, this is a reminder that platform security doesn't equal communication security. The channel might be encrypted, but the interaction still needs to be treated as untrusted until proven otherwise. Now, from modern messaging to something much older and frankly more uncomfortable. Researchers have disclosed a vulnerability in Nginx that's been sitting there for 18 years. 18 years! This isn't some obscure piece of software. Nginx is one of the most widely deployed web servers globally, sitting behind a huge portion of the internet's applications, APIs, and services. The vulnerability affects how Nginx handles certain HTTP requests. At a minimum, it can be used to trigger a denial of service condition, crashing the server. But more concerning is the potential for remote code execution, which would allow an attacker to run commands on the server itself. There are two takeaways here that matter. First, open source doesn't mean immune to long-lived flaws. Nginx has been extensively reviewed, deployed at scale, and trusted in high-risk environments for nearly 2 decades. And still, this slipped through. That's not a failure of open source, it's a reflection of how complex and layered modern software really is. And second, and more importantly, most organizations don't actually know where Nginx is running in their environment. It might be in a load balancer inside a container, embedded in a third-party product, or sitting behind an API gateway. And that's the real issue. Visibility. When a vulnerability like this drops, patching isn't just about applying an update. It's about first figuring out where the exposure exists. And in large environments, that's often the slowest part. So while the advice is to patch, and that's pretty obvious, the practical step here is maintaining an accurate inventory of internet-facing services and the components behind them, such as having a bills of material. Without that, even well-publicized vulnerabilities can sit unaddressed for longer than anyone is comfortable with. Now, let's talk about supply chain risks, and this one hits close to home for a lot of development teams. OpenAI has confirmed it was affected by a supply chain attack involving the TanStack ecosystem, which is widely used in modern JavaScript applications. The attack involved a malicious dependency being introduced upstream, which then made its way into downstream projects through normal build processes. This is how most software is built today. Developers rely heavily on open source packages, and those packages rely on other packages. It's layers of trust stacked on top of each other. The attacker doesn't need to breach your environment directly. They just need to compromise something you already trust. In this case, the malicious code was designed to exfiltrate sensitive information. And because it enters through legitimate channels, dependency updates, automated builds, it can operate without raising immediate red flags. What's important here is that even organizations with mature security programs can be affected. This isn't about negligence, it's about the reality that modern development pipelines are highly automated and deeply interconnected. Controls like software composition analysis, those are tools that can track and assess open source dependencies, are becoming essential. But even those have limits, especially when dealing with newly compromised packages that haven't yet been flagged. The more durable approach is layered, restricting what dependencies can do at runtime, monitoring outbound traffic for anomalies, and treating build environments as high-risk zones rather than trusted internal systems. All right, now let's shift to endpoint security, and this is one that's getting a lot of attention. A new zero-day exploit called Yellow Key has been published that allows an attacker with physical access to bypass Windows BitLocker encryption using a USB stick. BitLocker is widely used across enterprises and government to protect data at rest. The assumption has always been that if a device is encrypted, the data is safe, even if the data is lost or stolen. Well, Yellow Key challenges that assumption. The exploit works by manipulating NTFS transaction logs, essentially records the file system uses to recover from crashes, and getting Windows to replay those logs from a USB device during recovery mode. That process ends up deleting a critical system file, which forces Windows into a fallback state where the drive is decrypted and accessible without authentication. No password, no PIN, just physical access and a prepared USB. There are a couple of layers to this. At the surface, it's a serious issue for lost or stolen devices. Laptops, especially in hybrid work environments, are frequently outside controlled environments. If an attacker can get physical access, this becomes viable. But underneath that, there's a deeper concern. The researchers suggest this may point to a broader architecture issue in how Windows handles file system recovery and external inputs. And if that's true, we may see variations of this technique emerge. There's also mention of potential bypass for TPM pin protections, which, if confirmed, would significantly raise the impact. For now, there's no official patch, so mitigation is about reducing exposure, restricting boot options, disabling external boot where possible, and treating physical access as a meaningful threat factor again. Finally, we're on to our last story, and let's talk about something that's not a vulnerability in a traditional sense, but arguably one of the biggest risks developing right now: agentic AI. This refers to AI systems that don't just generate content, but take actions. They can read emails, update systems, write code, interact with APIs, essentially operate as autonomous agents inside an organization. And they're already in use, not as pilots or experiments, but in production workflow. The problem here is visibility. In many cases, security teams don't know what these agents are connected to, what permissions they have, or what data they are accessing. And unlike traditional software, these systems can make decisions dynamically based on context. There are three main areas where this risk is showing up. First, general purpose tools like coding assistants are being embedded into workflows, often without formal approval. These tools can access source code, internal documentation, and other sensitive data. Second, vendor-built agents using frameworks like the MCP protocol are being connected to external systems like calendars, file storage, ticketing platforms, and that creates a pathway where a seemingly harmless input like a calendar invite could influence system behavior. And third, and this is a pretty big one, internal teams are building their own agents. Marketing, finance, operations, they're creating automations that interact with real systems, often without any security review. It's effectively shadow IT, but with decision-making capability. The challenge here is that traditional controls don't map cleanly. You can't just put a firewall in front of an AI agent and call it done. The behavior is too dynamic. What's needed is a shift in approach. Security teams need hands-on familiarity with how these systems actually work, not just policy-level understanding. That means testing them, breaking them, and understanding their failure modes. Because right now, in many organizations, these systems are operating with more access than visibility. And that is not a stable position. So if you step back and look across all these stories, there's a consistent theme. Security isn't failing at the level we're expected. Encryption is holding. Core protocols are mostly solid. But the assumptions around how systems are used, integrated, and trusted, that's where the cracks are forming. Attackers are adapting to that reality. They're not forcing their way in. They're finding the edges, the gaps, and the behaviors that weren't designed with adversaries in mind. And for most organizations, the response isn't about deploying entirely new technology. It's about tightening visibility, reducing implicit trust, and being a lot more deliberate about how systems and people interact. And that's it for this week's Cyber Bytes. I'm Edwin Kwan, and I'll keep tracking how these trends evolve because none of them are one-off issues. They're all signals of where things are heading. I'll see you all next time.